Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the old gen versus the new gen of Smash Ultimate. I've taken my top 10 players from both eras of the game and we're going to be discussing which generation would win if they faced off. Let's get this out of the way before people get mad at me. Age has nothing to do with which side of the guard you're on. What I'm choosing from is how long these players have been relevant in Smash Ultimate. So if you were ranked in the top 50 or top 100 before Smash Ultimate came out, whether it be Smash 4 or even Brawl for some of these players, then you are considered old guard. And if you were unranked before Quarantine, you only got your first top 50 or top 100 after Quarantine, then you are considered for the new guard. And there's a couple players that have this weird in-between that I'll give a quick shout out to, but let's just get into our 10 players for both teams. So the 10 best players of the new gen right now are going to be Mia, Akola, Spargo, Sonics, Yoshidora, Zomba, Hurt, Osimo, Yaura, and Shattuck. And the 10 best players of the old gen right now are going to be Tweak, Light, MKLeo, Ken, Glooptity, Buzz, Kameme, Meister, Mars, and Shuton. And some players that are filling in this weird middle area are going to be Riddles, Zachary, Cola, Budace, and T. You're going to have Cola and Riddles just barely squeaking on to the last PGR before Quarantine. And I think these players could be considered new gen because they've been so much more dominant, and their big rise was pre-quarantine or post-quarantine rather, but they were ranked, so they technically don't fit the criteria that we've set. And for Zachary, Mudace, and T, these guys were really strong at the start of Smash Ultimate, and they could be considered old gen at this point because the start of Smash Ultimate was like 4 years ago, but they don't fit the criteria, so they're not going to be there. And then Odin's there just because he's not super active right now, but if he was more active, he'd probably be in this new gen top 10, so I wanted to give him a shout. And it is worth noting that at Watch the Throne, there was an old guard versus new guard crew battle, and the old guard did end up winning that, so maybe something to chew on while we're talking about some of these players. And that's the context that we're going to be going through in this video. We're going to be looking at it as if it was a crew battle, but instead of the 5 players that we have selected here, it is going to be 10 versus 10, and it is the best possible players that we can choose from both sides. And we are now going to be moving on to my trusty Google slide that has all 20 players on it. We have the best head-to-heads of these players as well as the hard counter. So best head-to-heads, these are just the players on the opposite team that I think our player would likely win against, and the hard counter is, the exact opposite. And starting off with MK Leo, you're going to have Osimo as the one that I'm fairly confident Leo would win. They've only played once before, and it was a fairly long time ago with Byleth, but Leo destroyed Osimo. He is very good versus Ryu. Just the way he plays and his spacing specifically is really difficult for this character to deal with, and I am confident that even without the Byleth, with the Joker, with the Aegis, whoever Leo's playing, he should be able to beat Osimo. And I had Mia here as well. They've never played before, but I do think that if MK Leo and Mia played, MK Leo should be favored in that head-to-head, even though Mia is such an incredible player. Leo is so good versus Game Watch. He has so many reps versus the character, and some of his characters do pretty well versus Game Watch as well. And the hard counters for Leo, I think the hardest one is probably going to be Zomba. He's beaten him on their last 2 encounters, and they were pretty dominant in both of those sets as well. And there's a couple other players that you would favor versus MK Leo as well, but just the way that Zomba won those last 2 sets, I would give it to him. Our next pro is going to be Tweak, and his best head-to-head is going to be probably against Shattuck. Diddy Kong does very well versus Corn, even though Corn is probably the best sword character versus Diddy. Monkey Flip is just very difficult for that archetype to deal with, and also Tweak is really good at the matchup. He's clearly put his time into studying Corn because he's aware of how good that character is, and the hard counter for Tweak is going to be Akola. He hasn't been able to beat him before. They have had a couple competitive sets, and I do think eventually Tweak will be able to get the win, but just based off the numbers, you kind of have to say it's Akola. Then our next one is going to be Light. His best head-to-head is going to be versus Sonics, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about Sonics, but in their past sets, Light has been extremely dominant, only dropping 1 set and winning like 8 or something total, which is pretty crazy. And his hard counter is going to be Mia. Again, it's a situation where Light can win that matchup, but you're playing against a guy who's aiming to be the best in the world, potentially the best in the world already in what is arguably your toughest matchup, and it's just not a fun time. Our next player is going to be Ken, and he's got a big advantage playing Sonic. Sonic is just amazing in this context because, remember, we're looking at this through the lens of a crew battle, and in the context of a crew battle, Sonic is an amazing character because he's just very difficult to counterpick, and there's only really one guy that you consistently send it against Ken, maybe 2 guys, either Sonics or Mia, and I chose Mia as the hard counter just because he has like a 6-0 record on Ken, something really bad. And then Ken's best head-to-head is likely going to be up against Yara. He has a 4-2 record there. So Yara has fought back from time to time, but overall Ken is winning that. And he's just a very strong asset to have on your team, but he's kind of countered out by Sonics on the other team, and we'll get to him in just a bit. You're going to have Lutin as our next player, and as you can see, he doesn't really have a best head-to-head. He doesn't have any super dominant matches versus any of the Prodigy players, and I just think Lutin can beat literally everyone on the other side. That's just kind of how this guy works. He is going to have the biggest struggles versus Sonics and Nicole. Those matchups are just really difficult. I would throw Mia in there as well, but Lutin has beaten Mia in the past. That only reaffirms my theory of Gluto can beat literally anyone, but is he the heavy favorite versus anyone? Well, probably some players, but without the numbers, I don't really want to say so. Our next pro is going to be Shutone, and his best head-to-head is also going to be versus Yaura. And if I had to choose between Ken and Shutone Descendant versus Yaura, it would definitely be Shutone because he's got a 6-0 record versus him. Olimar destroys Samus, and I would rather have Ken in the pocket because Sonic is so flexible, and his hard counter is going to be versus Akola. It is a 1-7 record in Akola's favor, and he's the best player in the world, so you can't feel too bad about it, but it's definitely a little bit rough. Our next pro is going to be, ooh, that's embarrassing. You guys weren't supposed to see that. Our next pro is going to be DeBuzz. His best head-to-head is going to be versus Shattuck. I believe that is a 4-0 record in his favor, and his hard counter is going to be versus Spargo, and I don't have it on the list right here, but I want to add that I think DeBuzz has a very real chance versus Mia because he's pretty much forcing Mia off of the Game & Watch, and Mia's Steve has gotten significantly better, but when you're playing your secondary character, you obviously are going to be at a slight disadvantage compared to DeBuzz, who is going to be on his main of Rosalina, and DeBuzz has also been picking up Steve recently, so he's going to know more about the character, because when you play a character, spoilers, you know how to abuse the character, you know the character's flaws, all that good stuff, so hopefully if DeBuzz does play Mia, he'll have the Steve figured out from his practice. Our next pro is going to be Kameme, and he's arguably the most important person for the old guard. He's going to have amazing records versus both Hurt and Yoshidora, and by amazing records versus Hurt, I mean he's up 2 on Hurt, but for Hurt, that is very impressive, and he's up 3-2 on Yoshidora, but he's won their last 3 encounters, and he's up 5-1 on Osimo, so he's great choices versus all of those players, but you would probably see him use versus Yoshidora or Hurt, likely versus Yoshidora, because I'm not super confident anyone else on the old guard could take out Yoshidora, and I don't think it's impossible. There's a lot of very talented players there, but his style of Yoshi is just very unpredictable, and I don't think anyone on the old guard, aside from maybe Shutone and Ken, have played a Yoshi of that level, and Kamehameha's just had the most success versus him, and Hurt is by far the best Snake player in the world, but everyone on the old guard is very good versus Snake. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to beat Hurt, so maybe you still want to use Kamehameha there, but likely we would see him come out versus Yoshidora, and his hard counter is going to be Spargo. They've only played once before, and it was 5 years ago before Spargo was even a pro player, but Spargo still won it, and Cloud does very well versus Sora as well as Aegis, so I expect that he's going to struggle versus Spargo. Next up is Meister. His best head-to-head is going to be versus Zombie. He's got a 3-1 record there, and the only time that Zomba was able to beat Meister was with the Lucina, and we haven't seen the Lucina in quite some time, and Zomba's gotten very good at the Game & Watch matchup, but it is still a very bad matchup for Robin. I'm confident that Meister would be able to win it. He's also got a ton of experience versus MK Big Boss, and his hard counters are going to be Sonics and Spargo. Those are 2 really tough matches for him. It doesn't really matter which one you pick because he has just been struggling a lot versus both of those players, and our final player on the old guard is going to be Mars, and he is the wild card of the old guard because he's never played Mia, he's never played Akola. Zero Suit does very well versus Game & Watch. I think that Zero Suit beats Steve, at least goes even with the character, and Mars has beaten Onan in the past, so there's definitely a high possibility that he beats both of those players, and I'm fairly confident that Mars would be able to beat Hurt. I know I was talking about earlier how Kamehameha might be our choice versus Hurt, but I would save Kamehameha for Yoshidora and send in Mars versus Hurt because he is incredible versus Snake, and Zero Suit is a very good character versus Snake if you know how to play around grenades, and Mars, as a Snake player, definitely knows how to play around grenades, and we don't really have any super hard counters for Mars just because he hasn't been competing a ton against any of these new guard players, but if I had to guess, I think Sonics would be a struggle just because they do very well versus Zero Suit, and Spargo as well, because in the past it's been a bit of a tough matchup, and Aegis is also a nightmare for ZSS. And now that we're done with the old guard, it's time to talk about the new guard, starting off with Mia. His best head-to-head is going to be versus Ken. He has a 6-0 record versus Ken, like we mentioned earlier. Very one-sided for him. And his hard counters are DeBuzz, MKLeo, Mars, maybe for all of these guys because we haven't seen him versus Mars or MKLeo. And while I do think that MKLeo and Mars should win those because of their character choices as well as their reps versus Meister, that doesn't mean that they're going to win it, because Mia is definitely on a different level than Meister. No offense to Meister, but this guy's arguably the best in the world. And then DeBuzz, he beats him with the Steve. If DeBuzz can learn the Steve, I'm very confident that DeBuzz can beat the Game Watch, but can he learn the Steve? That's really what we're going to have to see. Then you're going to have Spargo as our next one. He is very successful versus both DeBuzz and Meister, like we already mentioned, and he doesn't really have any hard counters on the other team, but Tweak, Light, Gluttony, and Leo all go 50-50 with Spargo. So there's a lot of people that you could send in versus Spargo, but none of them are sure to beat him. And I know Ken beat Spargo in their only encounter, but I'm fairly confident that Spargo would win the run back there just because of how much experience he's had versus Sonics. And he's also been trying out the core and a lot more specifically for Sonic, so I imagine he would use that in that matchup and probably clean house. Then you're going to have Sonics as our next player. Speaking of the Devil, his best head-to-head is going to be versus Gluttony, and his hard counter is going to be neutral special. It just keeps killing him when he goes off stage. Then you're going to have Akola. His best head-to-head is versus literally all of them. I'm very confident versus Akola and any other player on the old guard, but I'm going to say he is the best player in the world. And his hard counters are maybe Mars, maybe, but we just haven't seen it yet. On paper, I think Mars should win, but in practice, it's Akola. Well, let's actually talk about Sonic's hard counter. It is going to be Light. He has an 8-1 record versus him, but I will say the only time that Sonics was able to beat Light was at the last tournament that they played, which was MobaCon, and even though Light does end up winning the tournament over Sonics, that was 9 months ago, and I've seen the way that Sonics has completely dismantled Aegis. He has just figured that character out. The flowcharts are incredible. I imagine he has done the exact same thing for Fox. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to get the guaranteed dub versus Light, and until I see it, you still have to favor Light because his record is so good, and it is still a solid matchup for Fox, as well as Light just being incredible with it. He's just such a quick player, arguably the quickest player in the entire world on one of the fastest players in the entire game, so he could definitely keep up with Sonics, but I think all the work could definitely pay off. Our next pro is going to be Yoshidora. He has a 4-1 record versus Shutone, and as I already established, I think Kameme is definitely the best shot to take Yoshidora out. It's not impossible that other players can beat him, but if you haven't played versus Yoshidora before, I wouldn't really recommend it, especially in the style of a crew battle that Yoshi is feral. What can we say? Our next player is going to be Zomba, and his best head-to-head is going to be versus, honestly, Tweak or MKLeo. He kind of bopped both of them in their recent encounters, and his hard counter, as we established, is going to be Meister. Zomba has gotten significantly better at the Game Watch matchup, as I mentioned earlier on. He looked really good versus Mia at SmashCon, but he still ended up losing that set because Game Watch just hits Rob once, and he cannot get out of disadvantage, even if you're hitting the crazy zero death. So I'm curious to see, does he go back to the Lucina? Does he possibly pull the Link? I doubt the Link, but the Lucina is a real possibility, or is he just going to try to stick it with Rob, learn the zero death combo super well, so the second he hits Game Watch, he can secure that stock and then just, like, camp? I don't know. Our next pro is going to be Hurt. His best head-to-head is likely going to be up against Shutone, but to be honest, I'm not super sure because he is a massive X Factor. He hasn't played a majority of the old guard players. The only ones that he has played is Shutone, Ken, and Light. He's lost his only encounter versus Light, though it ends up going game 5. He's won his only encounter versus Ken, and he's down 3-2 overall versus Shutone, but he's won their last 2 encounters, and that's why I have that as the best head-to-head, but I really just don't know because he hasn't played against a ton of these players, and a lot of the players on the old guard are very good versus Snake, so I don't think Greninja would be a terrible idea, but as I already established, Greninja is not as good as his Snake, so I would probably like him to stick on his comfort role, especially against players of this caliber, and his hard counters are likely going to be Mars, because Mars is just phenomenal at that matchup, and DeBuzz as well. Rosalina has some very annoying tools versus Snake, and Light has already beaten her, but because the set was so close, I would put more faith in a player that I just haven't seen yet that's very good versus Snake. And I think for Kameme and her have played before. I know I said that earlier on, but I just want to reestablish that it's going to be 2-0 in Kameme's favor, so that would probably be Hurt's worst matchup. After Hurt, you're going to have Osimo. His best head-to-head is likely going to be up against Gluttony. They've only played twice before. You have Gluto winning it at LSI, but more recently, you have Osimo taking it at Cafeteria Cup. It does go Game 5, but historically, Gluttony hasn't been super good versus FGC characters, and Osimo is arguably the best FGC character that you have to offer, aside from Riddles, but he plays Kazuya. That's a different type of FGC, and his hard counter is definitely going to be Shutone. It is a 6-2 record in Shutone's favor, and he has won it twice before. It's not impossible, but you just wouldn't expect him to win it typically. And this is another situation where you just have Osimo not playing against a ton of the old guard because a lot of the old guard players are from America and he just hasn't really been to America that much. So there's a bit of an X factor there because Ryu's not a super common character in America as well, aside from Aiken. And I would say that Osimo is significantly better than Aiken. And that's saying a lot because Aiken is really good at this game. So I would be interested to see how some of those matchups go. Next up is going to be Yaura, and like the other two players that we just mentioned, he doesn't have a ton of reps versus a majority of the old guard, and I would say his best head-to-head is going to be versus Kameme. He's beaten him in their only encounter, and Sora doesn't do super well versus Samus, so I would expect him to win it if they have a rematch, and his hard counters are going to be Dabuz and Shuton, because Olimar is a really bad matchup for Samus. And it should be noted that Yaura does think that Samus beats Sonic, so maybe he could beat Sonic's, but also Sonic's is like a different level of Sonic, so we'll have to wait and see for that one. But our final player is going to be Shattuck. His best head-to-head is probably going to be up versus MKLeo. They've only played once, but it was pretty dominant in Shattuck's favor, especially that last game. I believe it was at 3 stock, if I recall correctly. If I was wrong, my bad. And his hard counters are going to be versus Dabuz and Light, both players being up 4-0 versus him. But Shattuck is getting better every single event that he goes to. Every single time he loses, the set is closer and closer, and I don't think it's going to be long before he's beating those guys. So now that we've gone over all the players and talked about the head-to-heads that they are the most likely to succeed or not succeed in, what I have done is I have made the list for both teams if they were to get perfectly countered, which players would align with which players, and I'm going to make it so you can't have any overlapping players, and using the powers of movie magic, we're going to have this list right here. And as you can see for the new gen, we're going to have a couple problems. You don't have direct counters for Mia, Akola, or Spargo, and I do think that all of these players have a chance versus all 3 of these guys, but I'm not confident that they will win, especially for Ken. Akola. Ken has beaten Akola before, but a majority of the time, it goes into Akola's favor. We just don't know for MKLeo and Mia, and Gluten Spargo really is a toss-up, but for the rest of them, these guys in the red should be winning that matchup. Light should beat Sonic's, Kameme should beat Yoshidora, Meister should beat Zamba, Marsh should be Hurt, Shuton should be Osimo, Dabuz should be Yaura, and Tweak should beat Shattuck. And for the old gen, there's also going to be a couple matchups that aren't super clear. You're going to have Mars likely going against Osimo, and Osimo has beaten Mars in their only encounter, but it was a very competitive Game 5 set, and it was 2 years ago, so it's kind of tough to tell. And Meister's going to be going up against Shattuck, and Meister has a 3-0 record on Shattuck, but they haven't played in quite some time, and Shattuck has gotten way better, and I think he's practiced the game and watched matchup a lot. I feel like you kind of have to in the current meta if you want to succeed, and Shattuck definitely wants to succeed the way that this guy has been improving, so I imagine that he's going to do better, but I'm not confident that he's going to win it. Unlike these other matchups, I'm confident Akola beats Tweak, Mia beats Light, Zomba beats Leo, Hurt beats Ken, Sonics beats Gluttony, Spargo beats Dabuz, Yaura beats Kameme, and Shuton gets beat by Yoshidora. Well, let's take off that one-person limit and see how many matchups I think people are still going to lose when we're including everybody. And as you can see from our top 3, there's still no matchups that I'm confident somebody is going to beat them in. I think there's a possibility that Mars and Dabuz can also beat Mia's side MKLeo, but I'm not confident. Akola, I'm going to add Kameme there. They've only played one time, and it did go into Kameme's favor, but that was a very long time ago, and it was also Akola's worst placement ever, so I'm just going to say he was playing bad that day, but there is, of course, the possibility. And for Spargo, I already talked about how he has a bunch of 50-50 matchups. For Sonics, it's just going to stay light. For Yoshidora, just Kameme. For Zamba, just Meister. For her, I'm going to add Dabuz there. For Osimo, I'm going to add Ken. For Yaura, I'm going to add Shuton because the Della Almar. And for Shattuck, I'm going to add Dabuz and Light. But for the old gen, this is where it gets a little problematic. For Tweak, you're going to add Mia and Zamba. For Light, you're going to add Akola. For MKLeo, it's actually just going to stay Zamba. Even though he got bodied by Akola on their last encounter, I think he'll be much better if they do have the rematch. For Ken, you're going to add Akola, Mia, and Sonics. All of those matchups are extremely tough. For Gluttony, you're adding Akola and Mia. For Dabuz, you're adding Akola and Yoshidora. Yaura, I was going to be the only one for Kameme still. Of course, there are other people that I think can beat him, but I'm not super sure about it, so that's why I'm not putting it there. For Meister, I'm going to add Spargo and Sonics. For Mars, I'm going to keep it as just Osimo because I just haven't seen him in competition, and I would still slightly favor players like Sonic and Spargo versus him, but they're only in the red if I'm certain that the player is going to beat the other player, and obviously upsets can happen. It's Smash Ultimate, but you get what I'm saying at this point. And then for Shuton, you're going to have Akola and Mia, and you're probably noticing a bit of a trend here. And that trend is going to be that the top 4 players in the world all happen to be on the new guard. Mia, Akola, Sonics, and Spargo. And for Mia and Akola specifically, there's only 2 guys in the entire world that are kind of able to beat those guys consistently aside from themselves, and that's Sonics and Spargo, and they're all on the same team, and that's why none of these players really have red weaknesses aside from Light just being really good versus Sonics, but they haven't played in quite some time, so that might not even be true anymore. And I really want to hammer this point home. Just because a player is not slotted next to beating someone doesn't mean that I don't think it could happen. MKLeo, for example. I think Akola and Spargo would both be favored versus MKLeo, but it's not over a 70% win. It's more like a 60%, 55-45 in the other guy's favor, but since I'm not super sure that the other guy is going to win, I'm not going to put it in the red text. And the reason that I have multiple players for Mia, Akola, and Spargo is because there's just no red text players for them, so I want to say everyone that I think has a decent chance. And for Mars, I just genuinely have no idea how he would do versus a lot of this new generational talent, and I just want to establish all that stuff so there's no confusion. And then for Plug, I realized that I never said who I actually thought was going to win between the two teams, even though it was implied, but just so everyone is very aware, I think that the new guard is probably going to sweep. And if I forgot an important matchup, it's probably just because I forgot. There's like 20 players here. Sometimes things are going to happen. And with that, I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'm very curious, what would your new guard team and your old guard team look like? Which team do you think would win? If there's anything I left out, got wrong, or if you just want to say hi, leave a comment down below. Be sure to sub while you're down there, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye!